Research is really, at the heart of it, just critical thinking. And aside from that, research is finding information and analyzing that information all in a systematic way. So anytime that you're answering a question for yourself or in your work, you're doing research. And I think there are some people, like there are various different types of research practices and methodologies. The type that I'm really focused on is applied research. I think one of the things that puts some people off of doing research is that they think it's much more scientific than it actually is. But what I'm talking about isn't doing anything that's going to go in a peer-reviewed journal. What you're trying to do isn't to add new human knowledge. You're just trying to find out anything that would be helpful to you in your business. You're trying to find out about your customers, about your competitors, and especially about how people behave in the real world, to make sure that your fundamental business decisions aren't based on assumptions, but are based on actual evidence or data. Applied research is any research that's done in order to meet a goal. And it's applied research in contrast to pure research or basic research. A business can do both. A business can, in R&D, just say be working on we're working with this new material to better understand the properties of this material. And we don't have a particular application in mind. Like you might do even some pure ethnographic research where you say, we're going to study this particular population. We're going to study teenagers in rural areas of the Northwest in the U.S. just to see how they behave. And it's not for any business purpose. We just really want to better understand this population and how they socialize. And that might be pure research. But then if you study the same pool of teenagers to say, we want to develop a new music app, a mobile music app that targets this group of teenagers, you might do very similar activities, but the rigor will be lower. You don't have to worry about your study being repeatable. You don't have to worry about eliminating all bias, because applied research is successful to the extent that it benefits you. So it can be flawed. And this is, I think, really important when people think about their capacity to do research. It's very important to be ethical, and it's very important to make sure that there aren't flaws in the way you're doing things that mean that you're drawing misleading conclusions. But aside from that, you can conduct studies that are scientifically very imperfect and still get useful results, because anything that benefits your business is useful and successful as applied research. Whereas for something to be considered, we've gone through a scientific process and here are the results, those have to meet a much higher standard of scrutiny than what you need to do in your business. I can't imagine doing design without research, because the very definition of design is solving a problem. And so unless you have acquired some knowledge about the world and about the problems in the world and the people who have those problems and why they have those problems, how can you design anything? Design in the absence of research is art. If what you consider design is self-expression, that's great. That's great. People can create artifacts or systems just because. But if they're not solving a problem, then they're not doing design. And if you haven't checked to see if that's a real problem, then again, you're just making something up and you're not being responsible as a designer. It's been interesting to see some of the reactions to some of the things I've been talking about in the kind of lean startup and lean UX community. And my response to that is that everything I'm talking about can be done as part of that. And my response is, why it's again going back to making sure that you're solving the right problem. Because what an agile methodology or what a lean startup methodology gets you is, okay, we're going to build a prototype and we're going to iterate on that prototype. But what if you're solving the wrong problem at the get-go? And that's what research will tell you. Research will help point you in the right direction, because any resources that you're using, no matter how few or no matter how efficiently you're running your business, anything you do to create something that either nobody wants or that can't function as part of a viable business, that's waste. And so I think people get caught up in these buzzwords. Like, I don't describe what I'm talking about as lean research. It's just research, and there are many, many different kinds. And it really is just asking questions to make sure that you're not basing your key business decisions on things you made up out of your head or things that you wish to be true. I think that's a big part of it. People have an idea, they go out there in the world and they say, oh, here's something that I'd like to see exist. But maybe you're a unique individual with unique needs. And those, like, who you are isn't representative of an audience that is representative of a market that needs to be served. Maybe there's something you just want to make for yourself, so go make it for yourself. But if what you actually want to do is create a product that serves real needs and is going to succeed in the marketplace, you need to understand how those needs are being met and the structure of that marketplace and where it's going. And I just can't imagine that there's any argument against that, thinking of something out of your own head that you hope is true or that you think is true is a better basis for business decisions than checking to make sure it at least might be true. Research is all about reducing risk. And you start with a certain set of assumptions in your product design process. And you talk about what is the risk of being wrong and how can we reduce that risk. And so you think about the research you want to do in terms of the time you have and the cost of doing that research versus the cost of just trying whatever you were going to try. And so I think you've done enough research when you feel that you've clearly identified all of the unknowns and all of your assumptions, and you validated enough that you can move forward to the next step in your process. So it might be we have fundamental assumptions about the way people are going to use the product and the way the marketplace is going. We've gotten some information that leads us to think that we were correct, and so now we're going to take the next step. Now we're going to build our prototype. And that would be enough at that time. And then maybe more questions are raised. It's never a process that stops at any time. You should be constantly, because the world is constantly changing. The only thing that you as an entrepreneur or a business owner or a designer has control over is the tiny part, the thing you're doing, whatever you're designing. The things you have no control over is everything else. And so it's up to you to constantly know what else is going on in the world that has implications for what you're building. Products that are the product of design processes that don't involve research are all around us. Anytime that you have a remote control for your television or your DVR that's too hard, that you can't understand, like people, I think often think that that's a problem in them, like they're not smart enough or capable enough or don't have the right knowledge to use these products. But really that's a failure on the part of the designer to understand what's important to people, how people think, and how these things fit in their lives. A great example from a couple of years ago of a company not doing its research was Netflix. And Netflix is a very beloved organization and brand. Those little red envelopes, people love getting them and love the convenience. And now there's the Netflix streaming service. So you don't even have to get a DVD in the mail. You can just select movies to watch, TV shows to watch immediately. A couple of years ago, because the DVD business is dropping off, because more and more people are comfortable and more interested in streaming media to their homes, they thought, well, we'll just split off this whole business. And they decided to call it Qwikster by a different name, and they decided to have two separate catalogs, two separate registration systems. You'd have different logins if you were a Netflix customer and a Qwikster customer. The reaction to this was terrible because they came out and they said, oh, this will be much more convenient for people. But clearly their definition of convenient was not the customer's definition of convenient. And this created a tremendous amount of expense for them, a tremendous amount of PR expense, and a huge amount of lost goodwill because people knew what Netflix was. People clearly understood that there were services with DVD by mail and there were services with streaming media. And all of the customers are very comfortable with navigating like that. And they just came in and said, oh, we're going to tell you what's more convenient for you. And it was obviously not more convenient. And they were not prepared as an organization for this level of disruption. And so they had to back off of that. And then it was Netflix again. And that's something, if they'd had more actual insight into what their customers valued and how their customers thought about their service, they could have had a much more graceful transition. As soon as you have an idea for a business, you should start doing research. Because the first question you ask, so you wake up, you've had this dream, this business idea came to you in a dream, and you thought, oh, this is going to be a huge business. I just thought of this problem everybody has, and I can solve it and make money doing it. And the first question you ask is, well, what would prevent me from doing that? What are all of the challenges, or what evidence is out there that I might be wrong? And just asking those questions of yourself. And that takes a lot of intellectual honesty. And this is why working in a team is so valuable, because you talk about other people on the team keeping you honest. And that is hugely important, because you should invite anybody on your team to say, oh, well, what about this? Well, what about that? Well, what about this? And come up with as many hypothetical situations. It's like, well, what happens if, Facebook buys this company and competes with you? What happens if Apple wants to get in that business? What happens if the market changes in a certain way? And that's the first step of research, is really interrogating yourself to make sure that, again, the assumptions that you're basing your business on conform to actual reality. And just asking yourself, how do I know that this problem exists, that people aren't already solving it in a way that's perfectly free and happy to them? This is something we always talk about, really thinking about your competitors and who your competitors are. And your biggest competitor is always nothing, like your customer taking no action and feeling perfectly content. And if that's the case, then maybe you're trying to solve a made-up problem that nobody actually has. And so your first research is, what's my evidence that people actually have this problem to such a degree, and they think of it as a problem, that they'd be willing to expend some effort or expend some money that benefits me in order to solve that problem? And that's like step one of research, and then everything flows from that. If what you've made is already flawed or already not going in the right direction, then optimizing that. Say oh, well, we're totally going in the wrong direction, but we're testing that, as opposed to starting, there's no downside to starting earlier. And I think what that is, that just comes from that fear and ego and not wanting to be proven wrong. There's a sense, I think, in some cases, of using that sunk cost to your advantage. If there's something that you just really want to see built, and this can happen in a lot of more engineering-driven companies. It's like you get it out there and then test it. Once it's built, then it's much harder to say, oh, you should have never built this thing in the first place, because it's out there. So you're like, well, now that it's there, I guess we should try to make it work, as opposed to starting before that and asking the question, should we build this? And if the answer is no, you don't build it. And so maybe there was somebody who just really, really wanted to build it. This happens all the time. Nobody wants to admit this is how a lot of things get created, is because somebody figured out that they could do it, or they just wanted to do it, or they wanted to see if they could do it. But it's just a solution in search of a problem. And so I think when somebody objects to research because they say, oh, let's just wait a little bit longer, what that means is, let's continue down this path until, even if we find things out that totally contradict the direction we've taken, there'll already be something out there, and so all the focus will be on optimizing what's out there, as opposed to going in a completely different direction. Our design work at Mule is research-based. It's always grounded in research. And that comes from my early agency experience. The first agency I worked for had a very research and strategy-driven methodology, and so that's always been a part of how I work. We find that some clients, I think because they don't have a clear sense of what's involved in that, or because they work very differently, don't necessarily understand how to value research or understand how many options they have in terms of different kinds of research they could do. They think about it as slow or academic, and so those interactions were a part of the impetus for writing the book, to put in the arguments that we make for always including a certain amount of research in our process. In addition to that, I think being in the Bay Area and in the startup-driven environment here, there's been a very strong drive to, just go out there and try it and fail fast and fail quickly and learn from your mistakes like that, and a devaluing of research. And all of these objections, and these are objections that these are objections that I address very specifically in my book, often come from a combination of misconceptions about how easy it is to start doing research and a certain amount of ego. Because the people with the strongest objections often have those not from a rational basis, but because they want to be the genius. They want to emulate the way that they think Steve Jobs made his design decisions. It comes springing forth from my mind, and it doesn't have any input from the real world. And that just, people want to have the right idea that they thought up themselves. But in reality, any really successful and delightful and innovative product design is the product of many, many people working together. And so you have to embrace that, as well as think very carefully about what information you need to design something successfully.